Hi, in this session we are going to learn about requirement lifecycle management. That's chapter number 5 in BABOK version number 3. Okay, so in this chapter we will basically focus on following areas. If you see, there are the tasks are: trace the requirement. How do we trace the requirement? And how do we maintain the requirement, how do we prioritize the requirement, how do we assess the requirement changes, and how do we approve the requirement. So if you see those tasks, those are all talking about how do we handle the requirement after we elicit and confirm them, right? So that's the basically process is described here. So the first task, if you are looking at it, is talking about tracing the requirement. It means we should be able to create a traceability or connect the requirement and able to see the complete picture. Again, second one, we talk about the maintaining the requirement, how the requirements are maintained accurate and current throughout the life cycle. So this is again another key point what the business analyst must focus on. The requirement must be relevant all the time. And the third task here is very important, is prioritize the requirement. The prioritizing is very important so that we always remain focused on the building the meaningful solution. So that only happens when you are able to prioritize the requirement, involving all the key stakeholders in the decision making process. It is not an independent process. It is basically the process which required uh, significant amount of discussion and analysis discussion, and then also decisions are done. So that is the prioritization process. We will have few games at that stage, and then we will go through that what are the different BA techniques the business analyst can use to prioritize the requirement, okay, effectively. And next we have is assess the requirement changes. Then we will also see how the requirements are, the changes are handled throughout the life cycle. So you will have to assess the changes to the requirement, and then after assessing them, if it is changes are approved, then you may have to do the impact analysis and the recommendation and then decisions. So that's basically one process. In case if it is not approved, then the changes may basically handled in a different way. So that is the basically change management process, and that will be we will be discussing at this stage. And then at the last, basically, how do we approve the requirement, that how we will work closely with the stakeholders and approve those requirements and the designs or the models what we have. So this is the basically the uh, the key points what we will be covering during the requirement life cycle. Okay, let me just go back to a little bit of the background. If you see, the purpose of the requirement lifecycle is to ensure that the business stakeholders and the solution requirements and the designs are aligned with each other. So they are in the sync, and it's not only in the sync means requirement with each other and the requirement with solution are in the sync. So that's important, and they are not only in the sync, they are relevant, and um, they are it's not only the relevant, but they are accurate and they're consistent, they are of high quality. It involves a level of control over the requirement and how the requirements will be implemented in actual solution. So this is basically is a key point. What we need to understand is how do we handle the requirement throughout the life cycle, and while handling the requirement we need to have a control in the way that the requirement stays relevant, they remain focused, they are prioritized, and they are always it carries the significant value. That's what basically a business analyst has to ensure all the time. And the requirement life cycle basically begins with the representation of the business need as a requirement. So when there is a need arised in the form of a problem or an opportunity, so that is the time actually the requirement arises, right? And it continues through the development of the solution, which we have already seen. So after we have defined the business need, we have understood what is a possible solution, and then we have um, um, scoped that solution or delimited the scope, and based on the scope we have come up with the high level features and functionalities and also other details, and that we have documented in the form of the vision document. You can consider that as a solution scope document or the vision document, and then from there we have also covered the investment and justification for the investment. So all that has been already been covered. So this is how the requirements are moving from one stage to another stage. So the when it goes to the basically elicitation stage, at the time we are basically discussing with the stakeholders in detail about those requirements we have identified, and uh, it's not only the requirement but additional details, business rules, processes are also been discussed and defined. So let me give you example what we have done. We have just reviewed the elicitation process. In the elicitation process we have understood the theory part, how the requirements are elicited from the different stakeholders and how do we document and confirm them. So we have taken a small example of basically the elicitation process, where we have asked three of the students basically to elicit the requirement, and when the requirement they have elicited and documented the requirement, then you will see that there is a difference between every process that has been documented by different stakeholders or the different the person. So we have to basically understand them and document and confirm. After confirmation we'll have to basically sync those requirement and finalize the requirement into a final requirement, and also support that requirement with a design or a model which we have done in the form of a process diagram. So that is basically uh, the uh, uh, the journey from the need to the documenting the requirement, right? Now ends with the solution and the requirement that represent is it are retired. So the process what we are talking about is a requirement life cycle. It will not basically end once we implement the solution. It ends only when the requirements are no longer needed in the organization. So till then it will continue. It means the requirement what you have elicited and you have implemented, those also will be archived in a project library. Those will be referred in the future in the form of in the new requirement, or in the form of document analysis, or it could be a referral document for other systems and so on, right? So that way you will see this requirement will stay relevant. And how our role as a business analyst is, how do we basically handle this requirement during the project life cycle and beyond the project life cycle, because the requirement life cycle is a different from the project life cycle. Project life cycle is basically once you implement the solution and it goes into the BAU process, then your role is significantly reduced, almost negligible, unless there is a new feature or functionalities is to be added in that existing solution. At that time again you have to basically restart your the cycle, project life cycle. But in this case of the requirement, basically requirement life cycle is a little different. Yeah, once you are elicited the requirement, you defined and confirmed and document and sign off. So that's basically one process, and those requirements have been implemented. When you are basically those requirements are implemented, at the time you may find there could be additional details are required, and those during that additional details you may find there could be additional discussions and the approvals may be required. So that way the requirement goes through a different level of a maturity, and when the requirement is implemented, then post implementation these are archived. So until the implementation it is in a different state, and after the implementation when it goes into the archival, but still they remain significantly relevant, because it those requirement will be referred for different reasons. it could be referred for audit purpose as well. For example, a particular solution is not functioning well, or there could be some issues. So if identify the auditor finds there is a issue, then they will say, oh, if the issue is coming from a particular solution, then if it is basically it traced back to a particular requirement, at the time the requirement is again retrieved and analyzed to see whether the requirement was correct and the business logic or the business rules what we have captured were correct, all the details are correct. So that has again at the time also it could be retrieved. So this is something what we need to see, the usage of requirement after the solution is implemented. Okay. Here is a small diagram which is basically provided. A is that you assess the requirement, assessing basically, and whether you want to bring it forward. If it is yes, then it is you need approval, you come go through the approval and the agreement from the stakeholder, build the consensus, and then once you are ready, then what happened, next step is basically you are going to trace the requirement, means connect with other requirement, and then you maintain them, store them in a proper way, in a proper place, so that they can be easily retrieved, and you also prioritize them, so you know what is the requirement background and how important this particular requirement is set. And then this will also help you to basically to understand the prioritization process will also explain you how the requirements are dependent on other requirement. That will again you can also refer that in the traceability matrix as well, but it will also talk about if particular requirement is A is important only if the B is um, uh, considered for development, that way it is. So you will have to basically check with that if there are any relevance are there. And again in the prioritization process also you may find some of the you may refer some of the discussion before you want to reuse this requirement in future. So this is the simple process, but in case if you find during the assessing, if you find that this is you don't need to basically bring forward this requirement, if it is says, then you store them into potential requirement, that is future requirement. Okay. And in again, if when you take it to the requirement to the approval stage and building the consensus, at this stage if it is not possible to obtain the approval or get the agreement, then if it is no, then again it goes into the potential requirement or the future requirement, or you can say that these are the requirement can be again addressed at later stage, that is once the solution is implemented. In case if you have basically a budget and also the requirement, at that time you can review this potential requirement to see if there is any way you can enhance and enrich the solution. So these are basically desired category requirement, or this could be like nice to have requirements. Okay. So this is basically a simple the requirement life cycle. Okay. Any queries you have? Okay, so I'll go to the next level, that's your core concept model in the requirement lifecycle management. Now as you have already seen, these are the left hand side, all the core concepts are there, 6 core concepts, and here we'll have to see what is the context in at this stage. In terms of the change, here this is a manage how proposed changes to the requirement and the designs are evaluated during the initiative. So the context for the change is related to the requirement changes, not for the change management in the organization. So there is a little bit of a the difference of the little bit of a difference, or how you basically refer this terminology at a particular situation. Okay, the context will change, and in the terms of a need, here it means what is a need. Our need is to trace, prioritize and maintain the requirement to ensure that the need is met or organizational goals are met or the problem is solved and the opportunities are basically realized. In terms of the solution, trace the requirement and the design to the solution components to ensure that the solution satisfy the need. Now this is very key point here. We need to trace the requirement and the design to the solution component, so that we ensure that each and every requirement is basically fulfills the solution goal and organizational goals, right? So that is important. And solution goal is basically to solve the problem or basically to realize the opportunity. In this case, they have mentioned here solution satisfies the need, right? Like that. Stakeholder will work closely with the key stakeholders to maintain understanding, agreement and approval of the requirements in the design. If you refer the previous diagram, there we have we need to seek the agreement from the stakeholders whether to approve a particular requirement. If it is approved, then it goes into the trace the requirement, maintain the requirement and prioritize the requirement. That's the basically task. In case if they don't you don't obtain any agreement from the stakeholder, then it is basically archived as a future requirement. Now the value here, in terms of the value, is again associated with the requirement. It means we maintain the requirement for reuse to extend the value beyond the current initiative. So it is the requirement is not only relevant during the project life cycle, but it is beyond the project life cycle. So that is how we are increasing the requirement, the value. In terms of the context, basically analyze the context to support tracing and prioritization activities. So this is again the key point, is that analyze the context to support the tracing and prioritization activities. Here, depending on the what we call the task, and depending on the particular goal or the objective, we can basically support the requirement tracing, so that requirement can be traced and connected with other requirements. That is how we'll get a complete picture. And again, second part is that it also helps us basically to prioritize the requirement depending on the need or depending on the objectives. Okay. So these are the core concept here. Let us basically go to the next level. This is the overall basically a diagram which is mentioned here. The requirement lifecycle management input and output diagram. Here, if you see the input requirements, design, proposed changes, and the requirements which are verified. So these are your inputs, and the output is basically these are the outputs actually. Requirements are traced, designs are traced, and requirements are maintained. Designs are maintained, requirements are prioritized, designs are prioritized, requirements change assessment, design change assessment, and requirements are approved. So these are the basically inputs you have used in these various tasks to obtain these outputs. But if you see the task here, if it is the tasks are basically 5 tasks are there. Trace the requirement, maintain the requirement, prioritize the requirement, assess the requirement changes, approve the requirements. Okay, these are the tasks, and this is the output what you have seen. If you see the trace the requirements are traced, designs are traced. Maintain the requirement, requirements are maintained, designs are maintained. Prioritize the requirements are prioritized, designs are prioritized. Assess the requirement changes assessment and design change assessment. This is a process basically. Approve the requirements are approved. So this is a stage when the final requirements are approved and designs are also approved along with the requirement. So this is a basically high level diagram for this chapter. Let me go to the next level. So this is the first task within the requirement lifecycle management, that is a trace requirement. So let's see how do we trace the requirement. Now, purpose of trace the requirement is basically to ensure that requirements and the designs at a different level are aligned to each other. We are able to trace them, right? And to manage the effects of the change to one level to related requirement. I'm just going to go back to our Excel sheet after a minute and then show you how we have done this one. Okay, and the traceability will enable faster and simpler impact analysis. It will also enable more reliable discoveries of inconsistencies and the gaps in the requirement. Okay, and it will also provide a deeper insight into the scope and the complexity of the changes. If I open this one, Excel sheet, hold on. I'm going to just a little bit stop sharing the BABOK and I'll go back to Excel sheet. So you will understand what the meaning of this usefulness of traceability. Now the points we have made here is basically it enables a faster and simple impact analysis. Now if you see, which we have already mentioned, if BR 1.0 changes, you know all these requirement will have to be reviewed. So you are not going to review BR 2 FR 2.1.1 because that is not part of the BR 1.0. And the same thing here, if it is BR 3.0 is going to be changed, so you will only review the requirement under this, so you don't have to consider the other requirements. So that is it. Helps or enables us to basically complete the impact analysis effectively. Okay, and then again it will also help you more reliable discovery of inconsistent consistencies and gap in the requirement. That in case if you find any missing requirement here, or if you find some requirement and which you don't know where to connect, so it then in case if that requirement looks uh, uh, what we call redundant, or it is not linked with any requirement, then you can further analyze to see whether you want to basically have that requirement, or it is needed, or it can be basically saved as archived as a future requirement. Okay, so this is because every requirement costs money when we want to implement them, right? Then we talk about the deeper insight into the scope and complexity of the change. What is your deeper insight, your scope and complexity? Now when we say here we want to introduce a change in the BR 1.0, so then you will know how many requirements are affected and where they are and how they are associated with the what we call functional requirement. So that is basically give you a picture about number of requirements are affected and complexity of those requirement. And if the more number of requirements are affected, then the more the complexity, because it is directly proportional to that. You are looking at the, if there is only one requirement is going to get impacted, for example in this case if the BR 3.0 is going to change, so the impact is going to be only one requirement. So in obviously the complexity will be less, because you will have to deal with certain number of stakeholders only, and certain requirement, only one requirement will be reviewed and what we call processed. But if you have to review and process like 5 requirements or maybe more in order to understand the impact analysis, then it takes a little more time, and again you will have to also interact with the stakeholders and explain them the changes and also the impact of each changes, and again overall impact of those changes to the on this whole solution, right? So that is how the complexity will increase. And also reliable assessment of which requirement has been addressed and which has not. Here we have color coded, right? If the particular requirement has completed, we have color coded them into green. If it is requirements are under process, then we know it is yellow. If it is not started, it is white, and it is overdue here, this particular requirement, that is FR 1.1.1, so that is we have marked as a red. So in this case red or orange. So in this case, in one glance, if you have 1000 requirements, you can get a overview about number of requirements are in the progress, number of requirements completed, and number of requirements are in a red zone, right? So that basically help you to get the complete and correct picture. So this is what the traceabilities are useful. Okay, I'm just going back to our BABOK. So it is clearly mentioned it is often difficult to accurately represent the needs and the solution without taking into account the relationship that exists between them. So this is something is important for us to know. A relationship exists between them. So when we are talking about a relationship, it is not only the parent and child, it could be subset, it could be one dependent on another, right? So that could be linear, and it could be like if you take one requirement, other requirement becomes relatively easier, like that. So there could be various types of relationship. You can have a mathematical relationship, you can have the other relationship. You can define the way you feel comfortable. Now the process traceability here. Value chain. What do you mean by value chain? What is a value chain is there? It means that what the value chain in terms of, you could have the department head, or maybe it could be a unit, business unit or something like that, and within that you may have a business process. Within the business process you may have a sub processes. Within the sub process you may have activity. Within the activity you may have a task. So this could be the way you can basically defunctional decompose your information, right? So that is how you can basically break down the requirement from the high level to the detail level. So at various level, if you are now here, this place there, we are addressing the process. The process basically at the high level is a value chain: business process, sub process, activity, task. For example, if you want to connect back with our example, that is a online banking solution. Within that, the fund transfer is a business process. Within the fund transfer, then you have add beneficiary is a sub process, right? And within the add beneficiary, activities are basically add the customer, what we call data, and the bank details. Then within that, what is a task? You add the bank name, IFSC code, and other details. In case if you don't have IFSC code, then other details you want to write, and as well as you can also add the limits. So those are different tasks. When you complete, then you complete the activity, that is the what we call adding the beneficiary. But adding the beneficiary is not sufficient in the adding the beneficiary detail is not sufficient to add a beneficiary, because you only add the details, but after the details then you may receive a text message, and whether have you added the person or not, then they will also, bank will them within themselves, they will do the validation process with to check whether the person who you have mentioned and the bank details and the account number, they matches the record, and then they will basically deactivate the beneficiary. So that's the basically add beneficiary process will complete. So activity is not going to complete just adding the beneficiary details. So there will be additional activities will be involved. So this is what we need to understand, how the basically processes are broken down to the detail level. Now if you see software requirement traceability, these are at the high level, it is a business need. Then we have a business requirement, that is a BRD. Then we have a stakeholder requirement. Within that business requirement you will have a stakeholders requirement. Okay, those are also captured in the business requirement document, and from there we derive the solution requirement. Now the business requirement is basically the stakeholders, the business stakeholders who define the requirement, and we capture them. But the solution requirement is that these are the solution requirement which are we need to consider them, or we need to deploy them in order to um, uh, achieve the business requirement. Now in the business requirement and the stakeholders will combinedly, you can define the business requirement document, and solution requirement will have basically both design related requirement, code related requirement, and test related requirement. It means it is not a code means you will explain the detail, but you will write the details about the functionality. You will also write the details about the data requirement, input output data, data format, and so on. So and if there is any business rule is there, then you may want to write down. If there are any calculations are there, you may want to write down, right? So that way it will basically talk about in terms of the design. For example, if you say in the fund transfer, you want to basically provide the details such as provide the input box, and then you can define the input box size and this thing, and to the customer to input the transfer amount. So that is the basically design. If there is any validations are there behind that, that also you can basically require. It has to be, if it has to be integer, then the system will basically write a small code. The developer will add the code that it has to be integer, not the characters, right? And in here in the similar way, if you see the solution requirement will also have the functional as well as non-functional requirement. For example, if you are talking about the functional requirement, a fund transfer is a functional requirement. But if you are talking about a non-functional requirement, then you may want to write about the performance or the volume it should handle. For example, at any given time, 25,000 customers should be able to transfer the fund without slowing down the systems. Okay, so that could be the one of the requirement. And it could also say that it should be encrypted and data should be transferred at certain ways. So that is also additional design and a non-functional requirement or security related functions requirement. So this is something which you need to capture in the solution requirement. You are capturing both functional as well as non-functional requirement. But in the BRD, that is a business requirement, you are capturing the business requirement, that is the bank wants the customer to transfer the fund online, right? So that is the business requirement. The stakeholder requirement could be, for example, the operations team may want to basically have reports generated means every 2 hours, so that they want to check whether the approvals are done correctly, or there is no issues with the transfer, such as. So that could be the operational. But then could be a regulatory person who may want to see that, if any particular account is transferring more than certain amount, even though it is allowed in the particular threshold, but they still want to see if there is any the illegal activities are going on, or it is large amount of transfers are going on, or if there is any issues are there. So those can a different kind of monitoring they may want to have, and that is basically they may ask you to implement additional requirement something. Okay, and in terms of basically a branch manager, he may want to see that, okay, you are sending all the requirement. If the particular approval is needed from my end, I don't want to have a single approval. You want me to send, please send me a daily approvals, and then I will select one by one, or at least send me once in the 3 hours or once in 4 hours, so I could basically receive them, because it will be too many emails or too many communications if every transactions comes to me that requires an approval, right? So that's basically a different needs. So when you are basically writing the fund transfer requirement, you may consider all of these. And then again, from the security perspective, they may say that we want a security the process embedded into the fund transfer, and that is basically the customer should be able to enter the on one-time password, so that we want to ensure that the customer has initiated the transfer and it is not something unauthorized transfer. So those are the requirement we basically elicit, and again embed them and basically create one single requirement, right? So that is your business and the stakeholder requirement. So business requirement is a fund transfer, but you'll, while defining the fund transfer requirement, you will have to basically talk to various other stakeholders and the subject matter expert and incorporate their needs in within the your requirement. That is how you can build one requirement. And the same thing when we are talking about, when we are defining the solution requirement, we have to ensure that solution requirement has the functional as well as non-functional requirement, and it covers the requirement details required for designing, coding, and testing. Okay, and even for the implementing as well. So even though this says implementation related requirements are captured as a transition requirement, but some of the requirements can be captured at this stage as well. Okay, so this is how the requirement will hierarchized. You can create the hierarchy. If you see the traceability matrix, if you recollect, there also we have as a high level business requirement, and then within that we have a second level also is a business requirement. BR 1.0 will have BR 1.1, 1.2, 1.3, and then from BR then we have a functional requirement and non-functional requirement, right? And those are functional, non-functional requirement are nothing but the solution requirement. Okay. So that's basically the overview of how the requirements are structured. Now, in order to basically move forward in the task, you will have the input is requirements and the designs. So requirements basically which you want to trace, and the design which you would like to trace. And it is a simple diagram basically. As we see, the inputs are requirement and design. The task is trace the requirement, output is requirements are traced and designs are traced. And you need is, this is a left hand side, additional support is you need to have a domain knowledge so that you can segregate the requirement, right? Or you can structure them accordingly. Information management approach is basically how the, what is the strategy you have planned for managing the information, and you can refer that strategy and use it in tracing the requirement. Okay, and then we have is a legal and regulatory information. You check with that if there is any legal or regulatory information, the requirements are there in managing the information, especially if there is going to be an audit on a regular basis, and how this information should be retrieved and who should be retrieved. Okay, and then we talk about the requirement management tool. Are we going to use any particular tool in order to store the requirement? So these are the basically guideline what we have provided. Let me see if there are any information we require. Okay, these outputs are used in the define design options at 7.5. Okay, that's the place. Okay, some of the elements what we have basically while completing the task, we have to check what is the level of formality is required. If you are depending on the solution approach, BA approach, whether it is a predictive or adaptive, or it is required a formal or informal or semi-formal, the details, or again, irrespective of what approach we may have, we also need to consider the stakeholders' comfort. Some places the stakeholders are not comfortable if the information is written in the high level. Okay. Okay. Next we talk about is basically relationship. We'll have to define the relationship among the requirements while structuring the requirement, or if you basically want to connect this requirement with each other, so you'll have to define. So there have basically few of the requirements, basically few of the relationship has been defined. You may choose what you prefer. Earlier I have mentioned the parent and child, right? A grandchild, like that, so that is okay. So that is basically nothing but derive. You may derive the requirement, right? So from a high level to the detail level. For example, a solution requirement is derived from the business and stakeholder requirement, like that. Now the second relationship is depend. Sometimes it is there is a relationship between the two requirement. Is A is you taken, then you have to take the B as well. So there is a necessity, and the it is due to the necessity or the effort. For example, if you take A, then you have to take a B as well. But if you don't take A, then you may not need to take a B. So like that, that is a necessity. Effort means simply because if you take A requirement, but if you take a B as well, you will be able to do your work with more comfort. How is that? So for example, if you if you use the calendar functionality, so the date selection becomes easier. So that's what is basically the role it plays here. So it is not necessary, but these users will feel comfortable in using the calendar functionality. Okay, that's effort related. Now it is satisfies that you have to check with that the relationship between the functional requirement and the solution component that is implementing it. So satisfy is basically uh, how the requirements are basically uh, um, satisfying. So the relationship between an implementation element and the requirement is satisfying. So that is important uh, to check the satisfaction level. Then validate, again you may have to basically have certain test case or the elements that can basically determine whether the solution fulfills the requirement. Okay, so that's a validation. Traceability repository is nothing but how would you store your requirement and maintain them throughout the life cycle. Okay, so the storage is what we are talking. Repository, how do you, as we talked about earlier, the we can use a SharePoint or maybe some other tool, something like a Jira or something, which you can basically trace and store the requirement. Now domain knowledge, here it is a knowledge of an expertise in the business domain needed to support the traceability. Here it is able to understand where the requirements are coming from. Some, for example, if you are working in the asset management kind of a business, so then you may have, there are lots of information as well. One is the fund management, then another part is basically settlement, third is basically generating the reports for reviewing, right, the performance and other reports, and a fourth could be the cash applications, how do you basically cash are used. So there are various components are there. If you have the domain knowledge, then you know what are the different the subdomains are there, and how you can basically assign your requirement into that particular subdomain, right. So it becomes easier for you to refer in the future. Then you have an information management approach that will basically provides a decision from planning activities concerning the traceability approaches. So here, as we talked about earlier, this you have to refer the previous chapter and see how we have planned in managing the information, right? And what kind of approach we have used. So you could basically refer that and complete your task. Legal and regulatory information, here you have to check any legislative rules and regulations that may be followed. Yes, that is very important when you are uh, what we call managing this information or tracing the requirement. So do you have any particular the policies, whether it is internal or external, that you need to refer and follow. And last, what I have already explained is the tool which you would like to use in storing and managing the BA information. Now the techniques, there are simple techniques. Is one is a business rule analysis that will talk about the on how the requirement, the rules that will support the requirement, any particular rules are there, and that you need to basically apply. Second is functional decomposition. This will help you to break down the information from the solution scope to the into the smaller components for the allocation. So, and you can also create the component, and again those requirements can be assigned to the different components, right. Then you have a process modeling. It will help you to basically visualize how the future state process will look like once you complete the requirement tracing, because that will help you to get the what we call requirement architecture or the business architecture kind of a thing. So today we have this, and these are the requirements which we have and we have assigned, and this is a complete picture will look like. So that is how you may have this kind of a detail. And scope modeling will help you to understand what requirements are within the scope, and while tracing the requirement, and what requirements are out of the scope, and if any requirement is out of the scope, then you may want to store them as a potential requirement or future requirement, like that. So who are the stakeholders who will be involved? The customers, domain subject matter expert, end users, implementation subject matter expert, operational support, project manager, sponsor, supplier, tester. This could be various stakeholders who are basically involved in the activity tracing the requirement. Output is your requirements are traced. It means you have clearly defined the relationship to all the requirement and also assign them to a solution component, and then further the solution component will be what we call assigned to a release or the phases or the iterations for development and deployment. Okay, that way. And same thing goes with the designs. All the requirement, the designs are basically traced and assigned to a solution component, and then further they will be basically assigned to a particular release or the phases or iterations. Okay, so that is how we will conclude this chapter. Okay, that's tracing the requirements. Any questions you have?